The wind had teeth that morning, biting at the open prairie like some starving wolf. You could hear it moan through the grass, feel it whistle through the loose boards of the new settlers' houses, as if testing every seam for weakness. Out beyond the creek, the horizon lay flat and endless, sky heavy with that pale light that never warms, and in that sea of gold and dust stood a shape so small and plain that newcomers often mistook it for a pile of dirt. The widow's sod house. They used to laugh when they rode past it. Looks like a badger hole, one man said. Another called it the prairie mole's mansion. Even the women, when they gathered to hang laundry or draw water, whispered about how pitiful it was, that a woman who'd buried her husband could live in such a thing. They said it smelled of the earth, that it must be dark inside, that no one could stand to sleep under so much dirt pressed above them. But the widow never answered. She kept her head down, worked her patch of garden, and let their laughter pass like weather. Her name was Clara Hensley, though most in the new settlement of Willow Bend just called her the widow. She'd come west with her husband, Daniel, a quiet man who'd been killed in a late-season blizzard their first winter. While the others built cabins from green pine hauled in wagons, Daniel had shown Clara how to cut sod, how to drive the spade deep into the prairie grass, lift thick, heavy slabs bound by roots, and lay them like bricks. He'd told her that wood burns, but earth does not. When he died, she finished the house alone, her hands cracked and bleeding, her eyes red from wind and grief. By the second spring, the settlement had doubled. Men felled trees from miles away and dragged them home behind teams of oxen, boasting about how civilized their homes would be. They built walls that breathed and leaked, roofs that cracked under the sun and froze under snow. And when they passed the widow's squat mound by the creek, they always felt a little taller for the sight of it. To them, it wasn't just ugly. It was a symbol of giving up, of refusing to live like proper folk. They didn't understand that the prairie itself had its own rules. It was in the third summer, the driest anyone could remember, that those rules came due. The grass turned brittle and yellow, creeks shrank into mud veins, and the air filled with the smell of dust and heat. The settlers muttered about rain, but none came. Every breath carried the weight of tinder waiting for a spark. On the evening it happened, Clara was out near her garden trench, watering what little remained of her beans. The sun had dipped low, swollen and red. The wind shifted strangely, coming from the north instead of the west, and she smelled something sharp and wrong. Not smoke at first, but resin, pitch and sap carried on the air. She straightened, hand shading her eyes, and saw the faintest smudge rising where the horizon met the sky. Up the hill, the town was finishing its Sunday supper. Children still chased each other between the rows of cabins. A fiddle scraped from an open window. Someone laughed, the sound drifting down the slope. And then came the shout, "Fire! Fire in the timber!" At first no one believed it could reach them. The wind had shifted before, and there'd been false alarms that ended in nothing. But this time, when the men ran to the ridge, they saw the whole North Prairie glowing orange. The fire was moving fast, too fast, riding the dry grass like powder running toward a fuse. Clara didn't wait. She hauled her water buckets, slammed the sod door tight, and began sealing the seams with wet clay. Inside, the air grew dim and close. She knew what to do. Daniel had told her a prairie fire can run faster than a horse and burn hotter than a forge. You don't fight it, he'd said. You hide from it. In the earth. Above her, the roar grew. The wind screamed, carrying cinders that lit the dry world like falling stars. Through the tiny vent hole, she saw the sky turn red, then black. She lay flat against the earthen floor, breathing slow, the scent of dirt thick and cool around her. Outside, wood cracked, glass shattered, and the voices of men vanished into the storm of flame. When morning came, the world was ash. The town of Willow Bend was gone. Every cabin reduced to black ribs and smoking soil. Even the creek looked scorched, its banks lined with dead fish and warped tools. The settlers stumbled through what remained, stunned, silent, their faces gray with soot. And there, in the middle of it all, untouched except for a singed patch of grass, stood Clara Hensley's sod house. Smoke drifted around it like fog, but its walls held firm, its roof still green with living grass. They gathered near her door, too ashamed to speak. The same mouths that had called her foolish now hung open in disbelief. When she stepped outside, her face streaked with dirt. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply looked at the ruin around her, then at them, and said softly, "The earth takes care of its own." In the days that followed, the widow's tiny home became the heart of the settlement. She opened her door to families who had nowhere else to sleep. Inside, the air smelled of damp soil and bread baking on the coals. Children pressed their hands against the cool earthen walls, marveling that something so humble could have saved them when their grand homes had failed. And the laughter that once followed her became a quiet respect. But as the settlers began to rebuild, a new tension settled over Willow Bend. Some whispered that Clara had known the fire would come, that her husband had been one of those frontier mystics who talked to the land. Others said she'd built her house on cursed ground, that maybe the fire had spared her for reasons not fit to speak of. And though they owed her their lives, fear has a way of twisting gratitude into envy. One morning, Clara found a crude sign nailed near her garden fence. "No place for witchcraft." The letters were burned into the wood. She stared at it for a long time, wind lifting her hair, the grass around her still black from the fire. Then she tore it down and carried it inside, laying it by the hearth. She didn't tell anyone. But that night, when the wind picked up again, she couldn't sleep. Outside, the prairie whispered in the dark, and in its low hum she thought she heard Daniel's voice. "They'll never understand. You listen to the earth, and they listen to each other." She got up and went to the door, opening it just enough to see the stars. They burned hard and clear above the silent plain, and in that moment she realized the fire had not been the last test the land would send. It had only been the first. The prairie always tests what man builds. The settlers of Willow Bend learned that the hard way after the fire. For weeks, smoke still clung to the grass, rising from roots deep underground that refused to die out. Every dawn brought that same burnt smell, the ghost of what had been home, fences, even the little schoolhouse that had never seen a full winter's term. The men worked in silence, rebuilding fences, hauling lumber from miles away, their faces sunken from long nights and short meals. The laughter that had once rolled through the settlement was gone. It had been burned away like everything else. Clara's sod house stood like an island of green in a sea of grey. Grass had already begun to creep back up its walls, drinking the dew before sunrise. Children who had once pointed at her roof now played on it, chasing beetles through the new shoots. Inside, the air stayed cool, even when the sun baked the plains to a shimmer. The settlers took turns sleeping in her main room, one family at a time, until the first few cabins could be raised again. She offered bread, coffee, silence. Her presence carried something solid, something unspoken that made the men lower their voices when she entered the room. But gratitude has a short life in a hard country. Once the first wooden walls rose again, the old feelings came creeping back, carried by the same wind that once fanned their pride. The men said she'd been lucky. The women whispered that no fire could have spared that house unless something unnatural had protected it. And when the preacher came from Dodge to hold service in the open prairie, his words gave their unease a name. He was a tall man, Reverend Kane, with the kind of eyes that burned when he spoke. His sermons were made for fearful times. He stood on the ashes of the old church foundation, Bible lifted high, and shouted that the Lord tests his flock with fire, that some are purified and some are revealed for what they truly are. He didn't say Clara's name, but his gaze never left her. "Even the devil," he thundered, "can shield his own when he wishes to fool the righteous." That night, as the settlers walked home, the talk grew darker. The men spat and shook their heads. The women clutched their children close. The sound of Clara's name in the air had changed. It carried suspicion now, not pity. And though she heard it all from her doorstep, she didn't argue. She had lived through worse storms than gossip. Inside, by lamplight, she took down the charred sign she had kept near the hearth, "No place for witchcraft," and set it gently into the fire. As it burned, she remembered Daniel again, his quiet laugh as he dug their foundation. "Let them build high," he'd said. "We'll build deep. Deep lasts longer." He'd been right, though she wished he could have seen how right. The following weeks brought a kind of uneasy peace. The new cabins rose, the gardens were replanted, and the town took shape once more. But something had changed. The settlers' eyes followed her now, even when they tried not to. They'd thank her for a loaf of bread, but their thanks came with quick glances, as if she were a flame too bright to look at for long. And when the nights turned cold again, no one came knocking for her firewood, though they knew she had plenty stored away. Then came the rain. It started as a blessing, steady, soft, the kind that darkens the soil and brings the scent of life back to the air. The settlers cheered, letting it wash their roofs, letting their children run barefoot through the puddles. But by the second week, it hadn't stopped. The ground turned to muck. The creek swelled over its banks. The cabins began to leak, their fresh-cut boards shrinking and warping in the endless wet. And still it rained. Clara's sod house didn't flinch. Its walls, bound by roots and clay, absorbed the water like a living thing, breathing it out through the grass above. Inside, her floor stayed dry, her hearth warm. She moved about quietly, patching where the walls wept a little, whispering thanks to the soil under her feet. On the 12th day, the creek flooded hard. Water came roaring down from the hills, sweeping fences, barrels, and half a cow through the main path of Willow Bend. The settlers scrambled to higher ground, shouting to each other through the downpour. Clara watched from her doorway as the current bit away the edge of her garden. She'd already lifted what she could: tools, seeds, a box of her husband's old things, onto a wooden shelf she'd built into the wall. The creek rose, and still she stayed. When the water reached her knees, she closed the door and prayed. By dawn, the rain broke. The prairie lay still, gleaming in the pale morning light. And again, when the settlers came down from the hills to count what they'd lost, the story was the same. Cabins toppled, wagons overturned, chickens drowned. But Clara's sod house still stood, muddy, soaked, but alive. The roof grass shimmered with beads of water like jewels. Smoke rose from her chimney, steady and thin. The settlers stared at her door in silence. It was too much to bear. The same woman who'd outlasted fire had now outlasted flood. The preacher's words returned to them like the echo of thunder. Even the devil can shield his own. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the sod roof, Clara heard footsteps outside. 3 men stood there, Reverend Kane among them, his coat damp, his face shadowed. The others were townsmen she knew, Mason and Cole, both of whom had lost their cabins twice now. Mason held his hat in both hands. Cole's jaw was tight. They didn't look at her so much as through her. "Mrs. Hensley," the Reverend said, his voice low but sharp, "you've been spared twice now. Once by fire, once by flood. Some in town feel that's unnatural. They're uneasy." Clara crossed her arms. "The earth's the same for everyone, Reverend. Some just build with it instead of against it." Cole scowled. "Don't mock us, woman. You think you're better than the rest of us because your dirt hovel didn't burn?" "I think nothing of the sort," she said, though her voice carried the weight of someone who had been alone too long to fear a man's anger. "I just listen when the land speaks. It told me to build low. You built high." Reverend Kane stepped closer. "The Lord speaks, Mrs. Hensley, not the land. You'd do well to remember that." Clara looked him in the eye. "Maybe they're one and the same." For a moment no one spoke. The rain dripped from their coats from the eaves above them. Then Mason muttered, "Reverend, let's go," and they turned away. But she knew what their silence meant. The line between fear and hatred is thin, and it had begun to tear. That night she dreamed of Daniel again. He was standing on the ridge above the creek, watching lightning crawl across the sky. His hand lifted toward her, but he didn't speak. Behind him, the prairie burned, not with fire, but with light. And somewhere in that glow, she heard the same whisper she'd heard during the storm. The land keeps score. When she woke, dawn had just broken. Smoke, thin and distant, rose from somewhere north. Her heart sank. Not again. She stepped outside, scanning the horizon, but this was no wildfire. It was too controlled, too steady. As the wind shifted, she caught the scent, tar and oak. Someone was burning timber deliberately. By midday, word reached her. The preacher had ordered a new chapel built. "A house to bring light back to this cursed land," he'd said. The settlers had gathered to help, their fear turning to fervor. They were building it on the highest ground in Willow Bend, right where the fire had first touched. From her doorway, Clara could see the faint outline of its rising frame against the horizon. It looked like a cross stabbed into the sky. In the days that followed, the town poured its grief and superstition into that chapel. The men hammered through the night. The women cooked and prayed. When the first bell rang from its unfinished tower, Clara felt it vibrate through the ground beneath her feet. She knew what it meant. It was not just a call to worship, it was a warning. Soon the talk began again. They said her sod house was an eyesore, that it spoiled the town's rebirth, that if they wanted Willow Bend to thrive, they'd have to tear out the last reminder of the fire. One night, as she fetched water, she found another sign planted near her door. "Move on, widow." She stood there in the moonlight, the prairie stretching quiet around her, and for the first time fear crept into her bones. Not for herself, but for the land that had sheltered her. She touched the wall beside her door, feeling the cool dampness of the earth. It seemed to hum faintly under her hand. "Alive, waiting," she whispered. "If they come for you, what then?" The ground gave no answer, but the wind picked up across the plain, carrying the faint crackle of distant thunder. By the time autumn settled across the prairie, Willow Bend no longer felt like the same town. The laughter that had once carried through its dirt paths was gone, replaced by a wary hush. People moved differently, heads lowered, eyes avoiding the widow's patch of land by the creek. The fire and flood had left marks not only on the soil, but on the hearts of the people, and Reverend Kane's new chapel gave their fear a pulpit. From its tower, little more than rough boards topped with a salvaged bell, the preacher's voice carried for miles. Every Sunday his words reached Clara's sod house like smoke creeping under a door. She never went up to hear him. She didn't need to. The prairie told her everything she needed to know. "God's fire cleanses," he'd shout. "It burns away the false shelters of this world. But sin hides low in the earth beneath our feet. We must dig it out, or we'll never be free." And the people, who once owed their lives to the widow's earthen refuge, nodded along because believing him was easier than facing the guilt that lived inside them. It's always easier to turn against the one who reminds you of your weakness. Clara didn't fight back. She stayed quiet, tending what remained of her garden, repairing her walls, and caring for the few who still visited. There weren't many, mostly children too young to understand hatred, who brought her wildflowers or chased frogs near her creek. She'd patch their torn clothes, give them biscuits, and send them home before dusk. Their laughter softened the silence, if only for a little while. But at night, she could feel the town's anger pressing closer. Once, she found stones in her garden, thrown from the road. Another morning, a dead crow nailed to her fence post. Then, one afternoon, she noticed hoofprints circling her sod house, the kind left by riders watching from a distance. The prairie, once her companion, began to feel like a witness to something dark gathering in the hearts of men. The trouble began, as most things do, with a single loss. A boy named Thomas, 10 years old, had wandered away from the settlement at sunset. His father, a man named Cole, had been one of those who'd stood at Clara's door after the flood. They searched the hills all night with lanterns and torches, calling his name into the wind. By morning, they found his small body near the creek, caught in the roots of a downed tree. The current had taken him. The town buried him at the edge of the prairie, beside what was left of the old schoolyard. The preacher led the service, his face grave, his voice trembling with righteous fury. "The Lord sends trials to test us," he said, "but sometimes the enemy walks among us, smiling as he brings sorrow to our doors." He didn't need to say her name. Everyone's eyes turned toward the far slope, where Clara's sod roof peeked through the grass. That night, as the sun sank red over the plains, a group of men rode down the ridge and stopped outside her house. Their shadows stretched long in the fading light. Cole was among them, face pale with grief, eyes glassy with something sharper than tears. He called out her name once, his voice rough. Clara stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "You should be with your family," she said softly. "My boy's dead," he spat. "The creek took him." "I'm sorry," she answered. "The current runs hard after a storm. I warned." "Don't you tell me what you warned," he snapped, voice rising. "You live closest to that creek. You knew it was swelling. You could have shouted a word, sent one of us a message, but you didn't. You sit here alone, watching, waiting, like the land tells you secrets the rest of us ain't meant to hear." "Cole," she said, calm but firm, "I couldn't have saved your boy." But grief had already turned into something unrecognizable. "You're cursed," he hissed. "Your house is cursed." The men behind him shifted uneasily. Some muttered prayers, others looked away, and then, without another word, they turned and rode off into the dark, leaving her standing in the wind, the earth humming faintly beneath her bare feet. She watched their lanterns fade into the distance and whispered, "Daniel, what am I supposed to do now?" Only the night answered, low and endless. The following days brought no rest. The settlers avoided her completely, even when she came into town for supplies. The general storekeeper, Mr. Yates, who'd once traded with her kindly enough, now made her set her coins on the counter instead of handing them over. "Folks are nervous," he said, eyes darting to the window. "Best not to linger." When she left, she heard him lock the door behind her. The preacher's sermons grew more fevered. "Temptation builds itself in shadows," he told the congregation. "It hides in the comfort of the earth, where the serpent first spoke." Each word sent another wave of suspicion through the town, and every whisper carried her name a little farther. One evening, as she returned home from the creek, she found the cross they'd built for the chapel nailed above her door. Its wood was charred black, its base wrapped in dried grass. She took it down gently, not in anger but in sorrow, and carried it to the fire. She burned it, not out of spite, but because she wouldn't let their fear live inside her walls. Still, she felt the balance shifting. The land that had once protected her now seemed restless. The wind no longer whispered, it howled. The nights grew colder earlier than they should have. Even the coyotes fell silent. She began to dream again, visions of the prairie aflame, of hands clawing through ash, of Daniel standing in the distance calling her name, though his face was lost to shadow. When she woke, her hands were always clenched, the smell of smoke lingering in her hair, though no fire burned nearby. And then, one morning, it happened. She woke to shouting, real shouting, not a dream. Men's voices carried down from the ridge. She stepped outside to see a crowd forming near the chapel, smoke rising from their torches. Women and children stood behind them, their faces drawn and pale. The preacher stood at the front, holding his Bible in one hand and a burning brand in the other. Cole was beside him. "Tonight," Reverend Kane cried, "we cleanse Willow Bend of what holds it down. We build anew. No more fear, no more fire, no more curse. We drive it out and reclaim this land in the Lord's name." The crowd roared in agreement. Clara knew before they even turned that they were coming for her. She backed into her home and barred the door. Her heart pounded hard enough to drown out everything else. For the first time, she truly felt small, not just alone, but trapped between the world of men and the soul of the land that had sheltered her. She pressed her palms against the walls, whispering, "Please, not them, not again." Outside, the hoofbeats drew closer. Then came the first stone. It struck her roof with a dull thud. Another followed. Then a voice, Cole's, shouted, "Burn it! Burn the witch out!" Torches flew. Flames licked the grass around her roof. The heat grew fast, crawling over the sod like a snake. Inside, smoke began to seep through the vent hole, thick and bitter. She coughed, covering her mouth, and dropped to her knees. The earth under her hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from something deeper. "Please," she whispered to the ground, "please help me." And then it happened, the strangest thing any of them would ever see. A wind rose from nowhere, cutting through the night like the breath of the plains themselves. It hit the burning torches first, snuffing them out with a sound like thunder. The men stumbled back, shouting, shielding their faces. The fire that had started on her roof died in an instant, smoke vanishing into the stars. The air crackled, alive, as though the whole prairie had drawn in a breath and was waiting to exhale. Lightning flashed on the horizon, followed by a roll of deep, rolling thunder, but there were no clouds, only dry stars and the endless black sky. The men froze. Reverend Kane dropped his torch, his face white as bone. "She calls the storm," he shouted. "Do you see it? She brings the devil's wind." Cole fell to his knees, clutching his cross. "Lord, forgive us." But the wind didn't stop. It swept through Willow Bend, tearing through half-built fences, ripping shingles from roofs, flattening crops. And when it passed, silence returned, so thick and perfect that even the crickets held their tongues. The men scattered, terrified. No one looked back. When the dawn came, Clara stepped out into the cold light. The prairie shimmered with dew, unburned. Her house stood untouched, but the chapel on the hill had been struck. The bell tower split down the middle. The bell itself blackened, twisted from heat that had come from nowhere. The settlers gathered at its ruins in silence. No one spoke her name aloud, but they didn't need to. Every glance toward the creek told the same story. That evening, Clara packed a small sack with her few belongings. Some bread, her husband's old pocket knife, and a folded scrap of paper with his handwriting still faint upon it. She stood at her door one last time, looking over the land that had been both her shield and her curse. She whispered to it, "You've done enough. I'll go." But as she turned to leave, a tremor passed through the ground, gentle, almost like a heartbeat. The wind carried her husband's voice again. "It's not done with you yet, Clara." Clara Hensley left Willow Bend before sunrise. The sky was still pale, the air cool enough to sting her fingers, and a light mist curled above the grass like smoke from invisible fires. She carried her sack over her shoulder and did not look back, not at the ruined chapel, not at the row of blackened stumps that had once been homes, not even at her sod house crouched by the creek like a loyal animal waiting for her to change her mind. The prairie stretched open before her, endless and uncertain. It had been her home, her husband's grave, her shelter, and her accuser. But as she walked, she felt no anger toward it. The earth had never betrayed her. It was people who did that, people who built walls so thin they could hear each other's envy through them. For a while she followed the old wagon track that led east toward the main trail. Her boots sank into the soft mud left by the last storm. Every few miles she stopped to rest, listening to the wind comb through the grass. Sometimes it almost sounded like Daniel's voice calling across the distance, the way he had when they were first carving a life out here. "Keep steady, Clara. The land always gives back what it takes if you wait long enough." By noon, she saw a rider on the horizon behind her, a dark shape rising from the shimmer of heat. Her stomach tightened. She kept walking, pretending not to notice, but the sound of hooves drew closer. When she turned, a man she recognized pulled his horse to a stop a few yards away. It was Mason, the quiet one who'd stood beside Reverend Kane that night but hadn't thrown a torch. His face looked older than she remembered, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. "Mrs. Hensley?" he called. Clara said nothing. He dismounted, holding his hat in both hands. "They don't speak of it in town, but things ain't right since you left. Crops won't take root. Wells have gone dry. The wind won't stop howling. I don't know what to believe anymore." "You don't have to believe anything," she said quietly. "The land was sick before I came, and it'll heal after I'm gone. It doesn't need either of us." He nodded, staring at the ground. "Reverend says it's punishment for letting sin go unpunished, but..." He hesitated. "I keep thinking, maybe it's the other way around." Clara studied him for a long time. Mason had always been kind to her husband, helping him haul sod when no one else would. "You've got a family," she said. "Go home. Don't let that man fill your head with fear. Fear makes fools out of decent men." He looked up. "You won't come back?" Her voice was soft but final. "I got no home to go back to." She turned and walked on. Mason watched her until the grass swallowed her figure, then rode away, his horse's hooves leaving a single crooked trail through the dew. For 3 days, Clara followed the river east. She slept in hollows and ate what she could gather: wild onions, roots, a handful of berries from thorny bushes. At night she built small fires, careful to keep them low so no one would see the smoke. The sky above her turned to glass, full of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. But the land grew strange the farther she went. The river thinned, its banks choked with ash-grey mud. The grass turned brittle again, snapping underfoot. It was as if the fire from years before still haunted the soil here, and always in the distance she thought she saw smoke, thin, uncertain, as though following her. On the 4th night, a storm rolled across the prairie. The wind bent the grass flat, rain cutting sideways. Clara found shelter under a low bluff and waited, shivering, beneath her blanket. Lightning split the sky in violent flashes. For a heartbeat she saw the outline of a man standing at the edge of the hill above her. Broad shoulders, still posture, familiar as breath. "Daniel?" she whispered. The thunder swallowed his answer. When the next flash came, he was gone. She pressed a trembling hand against the mud wall beside her, whispering the prayer she'd learned not from any preacher, but from the land itself, short, wordless, like asking forgiveness from something too old to speak. When the storm passed, morning came red and raw. She continued east, until she saw a thin trail of smoke that wasn't her own. Following it cautiously, she came upon a wagon camped near a line of cottonwoods. 2 people sat by the fire, a man sharpening a knife and a woman tending a pot. Their wagon was heavy with tools and barrels. Clara stayed at the edge of the clearing until the woman looked up. "You lost?" she called. Clara stepped closer, her voice hoarse. "Just traveling." The woman studied her, taking in the mud-stained dress, the worn boots, the tired face. "You're alone?" "Yes." "Then sit," the man said gruffly, without looking up. "Storm last night near tore the canvas off. You can warm up before you go on." Clara hesitated, then accepted. She sat by the fire, holding her hands out to the heat. The woman poured her coffee and Clara took it gratefully. "You come from the west?" the woman asked. "From Willow Bend." The man stopped sharpening his knife. "Heard about that place," he muttered. "Burned twice, flooded once. Folks said it was cursed." Clara didn't answer. The woman frowned. "You were there?" "I was." "Then how'd you live through it?" Clara's eyes lifted slowly from the fire. "By listening when the earth spoke." The woman blinked, not sure what that meant, but she didn't ask again. They shared their meal in uneasy silence. Before noon, Clara thanked them and started off once more. Behind her, she heard the man whisper, "You think that's the widow?" "Let her be," the woman murmured. "She's got ghosts following her enough." That night, Clara found an abandoned homestead, little more than a collapsed barn, and a chimney half swallowed by grass. She made camp near the ruins, lighting a small fire inside the stone base for warmth. The wind moaned through the hollow like a voice. As she sat watching the flames, she took out Daniel's paper from her sack. The ink had faded, but she knew the words by heart. "If ever the land turns against you, trust it anyway. It does what men cannot. It remembers." She pressed the note to her chest and whispered, "It remembers too much." Then she heard something faint, hooves again, far off. She doused the fire and crouched in the dark. The riders came from the west, 4 of them, moving fast. Even in the moonlight, she could see the glint of metal. They rode past her without slowing, their torches flickering against the night. She caught a glimpse of one face, Reverend Kane. Her stomach turned cold. They were following her. By dawn, the riders were close. She could feel it in the tremor of the ground beneath her boots. She crossed the river at a shallow bend and moved east, trying to put distance between them. But the prairie offered no cover. The horizon was an unbroken circle of sky and grass. No trees, no rocks, nowhere to hide. At midday, she stumbled onto a small ravine where the wind had carved deep ridges into the earth. She climbed down into its shadow and crouched. Low, listening, hooves thundered past above her. For a moment she dared to hope they'd lost her. Then a voice echoed down. "There!" A shot rang out. The bullet struck the dirt inches from her hand. She scrambled to her feet, running along the ravine's base as dust filled the air. Another shot cracked. Stones splintered near her shoulder. "Stop, witch!" Kane's voice roared above. "You can't outrun the Lord!" Clara stumbled, falling hard against the wall of the ravine. Blood filled her mouth. She looked up at the strip of sky overhead, brilliant blue, unbothered by the chaos below, and pressed her palms against the dirt one last time. "I'm not running," she whispered. "I'm going home." The ground shuddered beneath her. At first it was subtle, a low vibration, like a heartbeat growing louder. The men's horses panicked, rearing back. Kane shouted, struggling to steady his mount. Then the earth split open. A deafening crack tore through the ravine as one side collapsed, sending a wave of dirt and grass tumbling into the gully. The men shouted, their voices lost in the roar. Clara threw herself flat as the world came down around her. When the dust cleared, silence reigned. Two of the riders were gone, swallowed whole by the collapse. Another limped away, hoarse screaming. Reverend Kane's horse lay pinned beneath a slab of earth, thrashing. The preacher, his arm broken, crawled free and stared down into the ravine where Clara knelt amid the wreckage. His voice trembled. "What are you?" Clara rose slowly, covered in dust, eyes calm as the horizon. "Just part of the land," she said. "Like you." He scrambled backward, muttering prayers, clutching his Bible to his chest. "You'll burn for this," he hissed. "You'll burn in the end." Clara looked past him to the rising sun, its light spilling over the broken plain. "The land already burned," she said softly, "and it's still here." Kane stumbled to his feet and fled, vanishing into the tall grass, his shouts fading until there was only the wind again. Clara stood there for a long time, watching the prairie breathe. The ravine's new scar glowed red in the dawn light. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Then she turned east once more. That evening, as the sun sank behind her, she reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below lay the faint shimmer of water, a small lake ringed by cottonwoods. She made her way down and found the ground soft, rich with black soil. It was quiet here. No smoke, no voices, no fear, only the hum of insects and the whisper of grass. She knelt, pressed her hands into the dirt, and felt warmth rise through her fingers. "This'll do," she said aloud, and for the first time in years she smiled. She began to dig, slow and steady, the way Daniel had taught her, cutting sod, stacking it into low walls, shaping a new shelter from the same earth that had carried her this far. By the time the stars appeared, the first outline of her new home had taken shape, small and strong against the dark. When she lit a fire inside, its glow shone through the vent hole like a lantern's heart. She sat beside it, listening to the soft sigh of the prairie. For the first time in a long while, the land felt at peace. But far to the west, over the ridge she had crossed, a faint red light flickered on the horizon, like a distant flame being born again. The days that followed were quiet, so quiet that Clara sometimes wondered whether the world itself had chosen to stop breathing. Morning light poured through the vent of her new sod house, soft and golden, painting the packed earth walls in tones of clay and honey. Each sunrise came without the sound of hammers, without sermons carried by wind, without children crying from hunger or fever. The prairie belonged to no one here. It was just earth, wind and sky, three things that never lied. She worked from dawn till dusk. She cut deeper trenches for drainage, wove grass and roots into the roof seams, dug a small root cellar where the ground stayed cool and damp. Her hands toughened again, her back bent with labor, but the ache was familiar, almost comforting. Every motion, the swing of the spade, the press of sod, felt like prayer. When she stopped to rest, she would sit at the threshold and look out over the valley. The lake shimmered silver in the distance, its surface smooth as glass. Flocks of geese passed overhead in broken formations, their cries echoing like the memory of people long gone. Sometimes she thought she heard Daniel among them. By the second week, the house was finished. A single room, small as always, but strong. The fire pit was centered perfectly beneath the vent. Smoke rose in a steady ribbon into the open sky. The smell of fresh earth mixed with the faint sweetness of drying sage. Clara baked her first loaf of bread there, using the last of the flour from her sack. When she tore it open and steam rose from its crust, she whispered, "You see, Daniel, it can all begin again." That night she slept soundly for the first time in months. It was the wind that woke her, a cold, unnatural gust that slipped through the vent and snuffed out the fire. The air turned sharp, metallic. She sat up, listening. Nothing moved outside, not the reeds, not the insects, not even the frogs by the lake. The silence was too complete. Then came the faintest sound, hoofbeats, distant but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She rose, slipped on her boots, and stepped outside. The moon hung low, swollen and yellow, spilling light across the valley. In the distance, at the crest of the ridge she had crossed weeks before, she saw movement. A lone rider carrying a lantern that swung like a star bound to the earth. For a moment she thought it might be Mason. Maybe he'd followed her after all, come to tell her the town had changed its heart. But as the figure drew nearer, the gait was wrong. The posture stiffer, more commanding. And then she saw it, the long coat, the glint of something metallic at the man's side. Reverend Kane. He rode slowly down the slope, his horse's breath visible in the cold. When he reached the edge of her clearing, he stopped, lantern light washing over his face. He looked older, thinner, eyes sunken deep in shadow. "Mrs. Hensley," he said softly, "you've made yourself another hole." Clara stood still. "I didn't think you'd follow me this far." "I didn't mean to," he said. "But the land," he gestured toward the horizon behind him. "It's dying. The soil won't grow wheat. The river's turned black. People are leaving. Some say your curse followed me. Some say I brought it upon them because I didn't finish what I started." He dismounted, limping slightly. His arm was still wrapped in a sling, bones that had never healed right. "I came for peace," he said. "I came to end this." "You already ended it," she replied. "You burned your own town with fear." He took a step closer. "I burned nothing. You did." The words hung between them like smoke. Clara's voice hardened. "The land struck back. It wasn't me." "The land?" he sneered. "You talk about it like it's God." "Maybe it is," she said. "Maybe it's the only one that ever listens." Kane's hand tightened on his lantern. "Blasphemy," he muttered, then louder. "I've ridden 3 days to find you. I can't go back without proof. They won't let me. They need to see that the curse is broken, that you're gone." "Then look," Clara said, spreading her arms. "I'm here, alive. No fire, no flood, just dirt. If that frightens you, it's not my doing." He shook his head slowly. "You won't change what you are." She saw the glint of metal, his pistol, drawn from the holster. The lantern's light flashed across its barrel. For a moment, everything went silent again. The wind, the lake, even the crickets. Clara didn't move. Her breath came slow even. She looked not at the gun, but at the ground between them. "Do you hear that?" she asked quietly. "Hear what?" "The earth," she said. "It's warning you." Kane hesitated. Then he pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, but no bullet struck. The pistol misfired, exploding backward. Kane screamed, clutching his hand, as the weapon fell smoking to the ground. The horse reared, terrified, breaking loose from its reins and galloping toward the lake. Kane dropped to his knees, eyes wide with shock and pain. The lantern had fallen beside him, its glass cracked. Fire licked at the dry grass. "Put it out," Clara said sharply. He ignored her, still staring at his bleeding hand. The fire spread fast, racing through the reeds, circling the clearing. Clara ran for the bucket near her door, scooped water from the trough, and threw it, but the flames hissed, then flared, brighter, feeding on the wind. Within seconds, the entire ridge blazed. Kane stumbled to his feet, backing away. "It's you," he shouted. "Even now, you call it again." "I didn't," she cried. "It's the dry grass, the wind." But he was already running, vanishing into the orange glare. Clara turned toward her house. The roof had begun to smolder. She grabbed the spade, climbed up, and began throwing wet soil over the flames, choking them out. The sod hissed and blackened, but held. When the wind finally died, smoke drifted low and gray across the clearing. The fire had burned a wide circle around her home, leaving the valley's edge charred and hollow. The preacher was gone. For a long while she stood there, chest heaving, the spade still in her hand. Then faintly, from somewhere in the distance, she heard a cry, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. She followed it down toward the lake. Kane lay at the water's edge, half submerged, his lantern extinguished beside him. The light of dawn was creeping up behind the hills, touching the smoke with pink. He looked up as she approached, his face ghostly pale. "You win," he rasped. "The land takes care of its own. Isn't that what you said?" Clara knelt beside him, her voice steady. "It takes care of the ones who listen." He coughed, eyes glassy. "Maybe that's why we can't hear him anymore. We've been shouting over the earth for too long." She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. When his eyes closed, the prairie went still again. Clara buried him on the ridge where the fire had stopped. She marked the spot with a single stone and no words. By midday, clouds gathered, heavy, swollen, full of promise. The first drops fell as she finished packing the soil over his grave. Rain slicked her hair and darkened the earth to near black. For the rest of that day and through the night, it rained without pause. The ground drank greedily. Streams formed in the gullies, running clear and strong. When dawn came, the valley glowed green again, as if the land itself had decided to begin anew. Clara stood outside her sod house, arms crossed, watching the mist rise from the grass. The air smelled of wet soil and ash, but also of life. Birds returned, their wings flashing in the morning light. The lake rippled with movement. She whispered, "You kept your promise." Inside, she lit her fire and brewed coffee from the last of her beans. Steam rose from the tin cup, curling toward the vent like a small prayer. On the shelf lay Daniel's paper, edges worn thin. She unfolded it once more, tracing his words with her fingertips. "If ever the land turns against you, trust it anyway. It does what men cannot. It remembers." She smiled faintly. "It remembers, Daniel. It always does." Years passed. Travelers heading west sometimes found a patch of green valley amid the burned plains. A sod house, low to the ground, smoke rising gently from its chimney. An old woman would greet them at the door, offer bread and water, and ask nothing in return. Some said she was a healer, others swore she was a ghost. A few claimed that when the night wind blew across that valley, it carried a voice, soft, calm, speaking to the earth as if it were listening. Most travelers moved on, but those who stayed learned to build their homes low, thick-walled, close to the soil. They listened to the widow's advice about sod and drainage and windbreaks. They learned to read the sky, to feel the tremor of storms in the soles of their feet. And when, years later, another fire swept the prairie, those houses endured while others far away burned to ash. The settlers who survived told the story differently each time. Some said the widow had made a pact with the land. Others said she had simply understood it better than anyone else, but all agreed on one thing. When the flames died and the smoke cleared, a sod house still stood, green and whole, its roof glistening with dew. Long after Clara's death, children born in that valley still grew up hearing her name whispered in the grass. When they asked their parents if she'd been real, the answer was always the same: real as the soil under your feet. And if they ever doubted, all they had to do was look at the way the earth held its houses close, safe from wind and fire alike. Because somewhere beneath those walls, beneath the roots and clay, lay the memory of a woman who had trusted the ground when everyone else feared it. A woman who'd listened when the land spoke back. And the prairie, faithful as ever, kept her secret, whispering it to the wind for those who could still hear. The earth takes care of its own.